In this video, I want to explore what I want to call the traditional Church of England. Difficult to define exactly what I mean by that, but we're looking at a section of the Church of England that would include most of the following in most of its services. So formal liturgy and ritual, robed clergy, organ for leading the music, traditional hymns, choral music, that stands sort of Anglican choir, Book of Common Prayer, that's the 1662 prayer book, and probably also a traditional church building, by which I mean something that's got probably some leanings towards the Gothic, although there are plenty of really good quality, well presented modern ones made out of concrete. So it doesn't have to be old, but it's got to be well thought through, symbolically well thought through in terms of the building. So it's that sort of package that I'm lumping together and saying I want to call this the traditional Church of England. It's a section of the church which, from my experience and my understanding, is at present struggling numerically. The numbers that section of the church does have tend to be older. There's a distinct lack of younger people joining them, and then of course that has the inevitable knock-on impact on finance, and of course running any sort of church requires money. Interesting contrast to that though, there's signs in some areas that this tradition is valued. The most obvious one is the popularity of cathedrals, Cathedral Evensong particularly, and some of the, as I understand it, the Oxford and Cambridge colleges. There, again, Evensong is valued and people will go to it. What I want to do here is just sort of explore, reflect, think out loud on possible causes for the decline, and so therefore explore possibilities for ways in which this section of the C of E isn't just preserved as some cultural artifact, but is grown and developed to make its contribution to the spiritual life of the nation. Now, something I want to put on the table right at the beginning is that I don't see this revitalisation, building congregations in the traditional Church of England as in any way in opposition to what I'm going to call Holy Trinity Brompton Church of England, HTB. I don't see this as a zero-sum game. There are so many people who are currently not attending any church at all, Church of England or otherwise, that there doesn't seem to be any reason at all why we should see different traditions within the Church of England in competition. I'm also not convinced there's much overlap in demographic. Those who are likely to be drawn to a traditional C of E are unlikely to be the same people drawn to that HTB style of worship. So I don't actually think there's any meaningful conflict of interest between the two groups. I don't think they're actually competing for the same people. They may be competing in the sense that somebody might dip into both traditions and then make a decision between them, but I'm not sure you're going to get many people who are floating between the two. Now, in these explorations, I've got no intention at all of being in any way critical of this HTB strand of the church. So really what I'm looking at is I want to focus on that traditional Church of England, but I'm looking at it as a both and with that HTB style, not an either or. Now, the immediate context from which I'm making these reflections isn't actually as parish priest. It's well over 20 years since I was one of those. It's reflection. My experience at the moment then is a school chaplain. That's sort of been for 25 years in high academic achievement boys' schools. Currently, I've got 1,000 boys in my school, Church of England school, and they are church literate. And by this I mean we have regular services in school chapel. And they are, very Anglican, so, start the service, the Lord be with you, and they'll respond and also with you. And it goes on from there, really. We sing traditional hymns accompanied by an organ. The Bible is read. They'll sit in silent reflection. There's prayers led from the lectern, and we all say the traditional version of the Lord's Prayer. They also have about 6 services per year. In the cathedral, the church is set in the cathedral close the school is set in the cathedral close in Salisbury. And one of those services each year is a Eucharist, and there's about 300 of the boys will come up and receive the bread and wine. Clearly means something to them. I'm not going to go into any detail at this stage as to exactly what it means, but they take the more difficult option of actually engaging in a Eucharist. So this should be a great resource for the Church of England. 1,000 young men. So a very specific question for my context is, how can I feed these boys into their parish churches now? And how can I equip them so when they go off to university, most of them, because of the demographic, are going to do that? How am I equipping them so when they go to university, they will know how to find and fit in with a church where they go? Now, it's this traditional Church of England demographic I'm most concerned about. For those comfortable with that HTB Christian faith, they're well catered for locally. To the school, there's a vibrant, lively, large numbers Church of England church in that HTB tradition. There's also locally, there's this sort of independent fellowship type churches, one of which is very vibrant and significant in the chaplaincy within school, working alongside me. They meet in just a local comprehensive school. For that HTB line of theology and churchmanship, they can pick up online worship very easily with outfits like Hillsong, and there are hours and hours of Soul Survivor on YouTube and similar big conference type teaching in that tradition. Now, we quite often use that sort of the teaching and the music in the voluntary lunchtime chapel activities. And so one of the things I know from that is that doesn't suit all the boys. And it's that group of boys who, that really isn't, that's not them. That's not where they're going to fit. And so where can these boys go in the Church of England, which will mean that when they turn up at a church, they don't look around and think, well, everybody else is the age of my grandparents. How do we draw these young men into the traditional Church of England? I'm excluding here those who are choristers, because that's a slightly different issue. They're there because they sing, they're members of the choir, they've got a place. I'm talking about the young man, 14, 15 upwards, who's going to church independently, and he goes into what I'm convinced would suit him if he could learn how to engage with it, that traditional Church of England church. And so really what I'm exploring here is that just way of developing and growing that section of the Church of England so people know about it, people are attracted to it, people join it, and that section of the Church of England is able to grow. Let's start then with something which I think is a pretty key issue here, and that's I'll use the word supernatural. I'm going to define it. I think we can probably all work out where I'm going with this one. There was a survey on spirituality 20 years ago probably now, but it struck me that one of the questions identified that the church was the last place that people expected to experience the supernatural. Slightly worrying, really, when it's a church where we're supposed to meet with God. But it's very easy for the Church of England particularly to end up simply as the Department for Religion of the civil service. I spent a number of years working as a civil servant. I'm now an Anglican priest, and more specifically a school chaplain. So it's not difficult, in fact, to see my role in that sort of rather civil servant manner, delivering an efficient model. Anglicanism traditionally has had some difficulty with the supernatural. It inherits a substantial dose of that Protestant rationalism, which is quite uncomfortable with the miraculous and the supernatural. There's a tendency to associate the supernatural with that which is, well, it's not quite respectable. The word enthusiasm was used in a rather derogatory way of the Methodists in the 18th century, early 19th century, as they broke away from the Church of England. Many within the Church of England, particularly those in the traditional Church of England that I'm exploring now, would look on that, the charismatic wing, that Holy Trinity Brompton strand within the Church of England, and look at it with significant suspicion and rather look down on it. As a church, we're far more comfortable with the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount than with God speaking to Moses through the burning bush, or Jesus dealing with demons or raising the dead. Paul is far safer when he's dealing with some convoluted theology that the clergy can pull a few verses out and extend that into a sermon which is preached earnestly, and the congregation really can't follow it, and it's probably largely irrelevant to what they're going to be doing on Monday, but far more comfortable with that than when we're looking at Paul dealing with the gifts of the Spirit or healing people. So it's rather unsettling. That might turn our lives upside down, and it might actually be profoundly relevant to what those in ordinary jobs will be doing on the Monday. Now, I need to pull back a little bit here and get a slightly higher resolution view of this, because that Holy Trinity Brompton strand of the Church of England is not actually lacking in the supernatural. That sort of charismatic type strand, Church of England and elsewhere, is pretty big on miracles, healing, speaking in tongues. It's very much what it's about. Most of the independent churches which people will encounter maybe through holiday clubs will also follow that sort of pattern. This no supernatural does, however, apply very much to the mainstream C of E, and probably is strongly found within that traditional Church of England that I'm wanting to explore. You're going to find it as well in Methodist, URC, traditional Baptist churches, which people are going to encounter through weddings, baptisms, funerals. So more high resolution analysis would want us teasing out distinctions between feeling uncomfortable with the supernatural, full stop, just give me Book of Common Prayer, choral evensong, a King James in a cathedral. That's the sort of church I like. Don't want any of this sort of woo-woo spooky stuff. There's another type where they might be feeling uncomfortable with the type of church where they encounter the supernatural. So that would be the charismatic wing of the church. So is it the supernatural they're uncomfortable with, or just the way that it's presented within church? And then there's another group who've just never been in a traditional C of E church which gave any sense of engaging with the supernatural at all. One strand of criticism of the current C of E, which I suspect is coming from that first of those I listed on the last slide, that just feel uncomfortable with the supernatural, full stop. Just give me the BCP choral evensong, King James in a cathedral. That's the sort of church I like. Now, I think that's probably well represented by Douglas Murray. That is a quote from a recent Spectator. So Douglas Murray writes, "At our local church, the choir that first taught me how to read music was summarily scrapped. A new vicar brought in guitars and microphones. Soon a drum kit loomed. Common Prayer and King James were out, of course, and new hymns and worse liturgy came in. Soon the walls were whitewashed, the carpet was down, and the vicar gave his talk. Sitting on the altar, swinging his legs, the Murrays were off." So let's call this position aesthetic traditionalism. For many people attending choral evensong at a cathedral, then I suspect that's pretty well the limit of their experience. Now, the aesthetic is enormously valuable and should be included in all Christian worship. I certainly don't want to disparage it. It can be a great starting point to build something more substantial. Attend for the choral music and realise there's more to it than just the music. And I think there's considerable substance to this aesthetic traditionalism, which is life enhancing for those who in fact never get beyond it and just simply sit in a cathedral periodically and engage with choral evensong at whatever level suits them. But I'm primarily interested in taking people further. It's very easy for this Douglas Murray criticism, this aesthetic traditionalism understanding of Christianity, to miss what is a much bigger understanding of Christianity and the church as what it could be about for them. I rather get the impression that what the sort of Douglas Murrays of this world want is they want the church to provide regular Sunday services in that traditionalist Church of England model, in the style that they like, so those services are always available for them to attend on an ad hoc basis when it suits them. There's a considerable missing the point, I think, from that Douglas Murray position here. But I do want to hang on to his critique because I think it's worth really engaging with. I also want to hang on to Douglas Murray personally and those like him because, well, they want to hang on to the C of E and therefore they're important. And they probably represent a reasonable number of people who we would do well to keep on board and gently draw further along on a spiritual journey. However, if we're going to recover the supernatural, which I think is pretty key to revitalisation and development and moving on of this traditional Church of England, then there's a major question. Is that actually going to suit this Douglas Murray aesthetic traditionalism? Because this looks like an emphasis on the aspect of Christianity, which I'm going to take a guess they're likely to find the most difficult. And this leads me then on to another key issue here, and that is the Gnostic. Now, the way I'm using the term Gnostic here, I'm taking this from Dr. Gavin Ashenden. He's a former chaplain to the Queen, and I picked this up in a conversation in a Spectator podcast, and when I heard him say this and talk about it, just immediately resonated with my own experience as a school chaplain. I think it's very relevant as well to this looking at the traditional Church of England. As we look at the New Testament, and we can also see that in the Old Testament as well, what we see is pretty clear that there's something the Holy Spirit does which gets people to know and recognise God. There's references, there's new birth imagery, there's those who enter the kingdom of heaven. There's something which happens to some people. We'll call this, they become enlightened, they know something, they've engaged with God, there's an existential response from them, and they're different from those who do not. Now, okay, problem with using the term Gnostic is it exists on a scale. You've got one end of it who I would classify just as sort of barking mad conspiracy theorists who have this sort of, Illuminati special knowledge which sets them far. Well, we're not there, but there is a very valid aspect to this idea of Gnosticism where some people clearly know God in a way that others don't. Now, Anglicanism finds this very difficult because, well, we're a state church. We're supposed to be there for everybody. Well, okay, so what happens if Christianity is not for everybody? Yeah, okay, we've got John 3:16, God so loved the world. But there's also very clearly that sense of, well, God might call the entire world, but it doesn't look as if everybody responds. It doesn't look as if everybody does get awakened. It doesn't look as if everybody has that existential encounter with God that changes them. Jesus constantly talks about the division. He talks about sheep and goats. He's got seeds that grow and seeds that don't grow. He's got those who have ears to hear, those who presumably have ears that don't hear. Anglicanism, well, we're pretty uncomfortable with this and we don't really know how to manage it. As a school chaplain, I can very much identify with this. I stand before boys in my school chapel and they're at my school because it is an excellent school. That's what their parents say. The parents haven't sent them to that school because it has a clear Christian ethos. Now, I think there's a causal connection between the Christian ethos and it's an excellent school. I'm not going to go into that here. But what this means is that I've got boys there who attend those school chapel services each week, happily on board in the main. They're happily on board with the sort of moral teaching found in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, at least in the sense they know that's how they're supposed to live, that's what they're supposed to believe. I'm certainly not suggesting for an instant that's how they actually live, either now as schoolboys or when they grow up either. However, things get far more uncomfortable if I'm going to be standing in front of them talking about the supernatural, the miraculous, and those whose lives are changed as they commit their lives to Christ, that born again sort of imagery. That's where the Gnosticism comes in. And what really gets people's backs up then is the suggestion that there are some who have responded to the call of God. They are living different types of lives to those who have not, those who have recognised the supernatural element of a fulfilled life and those who have not. To go down this route is challenged as it was divisive. Some people you're claiming that this special knowledge, you're claiming to have superiority over others. The point that committed Christians actually accepted their own sinfulness and need for God to sort them out because they can't do it themselves, that's conveniently ignored. So this issue of Gnosticism is a problem. And this tends to lead then to the idea that this division between those who've accepted Christ and those who haven't, Jesus teaching sheep, goats, weeds, seeds that grow, seeds that don't. No, you can't do that on this sort of idea of the Gnostic. You've got to do that purely in terms of the moral, those who follow the Ten Commandments and those who do not. Anglicanism finds this very difficult dealing with these issues because we are a state church, combined in my case with being a school chaplain. I'm just there for everybody in the church. When I was a parish priest, I was there for everybody in the parish. Anyone in the parish wants to get married, baptised, have a funeral for their loved one. You know, there's a substantial legal right for them to turn up at the church and say, do it for me. But in the Bible, we've got this very, very strong, we'll call them hints, could be even stronger than that, hints that Christianity is not there for everybody, in the sense that there's this particular calling from God to take up our cross and follow Jesus, to be awakened within the faith, to be filled by the Spirit. And not everyone does this. So there we are, the Church of England. We've got this uncomfortable idea, we've got the supernatural, we've got this idea of the Gnostic, and it's difficult. So tendency then, what do we do? Well, there's a tendency to just reject the supernatural because it solves lots of problems. And combined with that tendency to reject the supernatural, what's left? Well, a tendency to then drift into the political. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but it is if that's all the church is. Now, I've heard Tom Holland and others talking about senior Anglican clerics who are indistinguishable from Lib Dem politicians in what they're saying. There's nothing inherently wrong with Lib Dem politicians, but there's no shortage of nice liberal people saying nice liberal things on Radio 4. The church really should be saying something different. It should be clearly distinct. If you've got a bishop on Radio 4 and you've got a Lib Dem politician, you should be able to tell the difference between what they're saying without knowing who it is who's talking. So when they have a bishop on there, do people really just want more of the same? I think, and this is, I think, where the traditional Church of England has got to get a grip and work on this. I think that what people want is they've got a bishop on Radio 4 or anywhere else. They want a different voice, a prophetic voice, a biblical voice, a voice that's willing to engage with the supernatural, a voice that's willing to risk moving into that territory of the Gnostic. And this criticism, of course, of these, bishops as Lib Dem politicians is coming from those who are in one sense outside the church, the Tom Hollands and Douglas Murrays of this world. Outside the church in many ways, but people who they've clearly got a deep yearning for what the church could potentially offer to them if it got its act together. And so the whole of this video really is premised on the idea that there could be plenty, I believe there are plenty of Tom Hollands and Douglas Murrays out there, and these blokes are not that old compared to the age of many Church of England congregations. There's lots of Tom Hollands and Douglas Murrays out there, and we would do well to speak to them and draw them into the church. Now, I think there are probably quite a number of layers here of paradox and potential self-contradiction from the sort of Tom Hollands and Douglas Murrays of this world as they criticise these bishops indistinguishable from the Lib Dem politician, because I do wonder if they really wouldn't like it if the bishop moved off that standard sort of script and really did start to engage with the supernatural and move into that territory of the Gnostic. But they recognise, and I think plenty of other people do, there's something distinctly off-putting about that rather Laodicean, the neither hot nor cold, I'll spit you out, that you get from many clergy who appear in the media. Now, of course, not all clergy you get in the media are those bland Lib Dem types. For those churches more inclined to action, they can very easily drift into simply aligning themselves with some sort of utopian political movement, Corbynist to Socialist, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, etc. Now, of course, what this enables the church to do is have a deep vision for a better future. It feels as if it's doing something really significant because it's riding on the back of a movement with really serious numbers and media reach. And of course, here we go, above all, it removes the messiness of having to deal with the supernatural and the Gnostic. The Gnostic then just simply moves into those who are woke and those who aren't. God can be kept suitably at a distance and just the supplier of some nice moral guidelines. Now, of course, this does lead to a major issue here. What we receive from the mainstream media is manufactured by the news industry from their raw materials. This, of course, means they're only going to interview clerics who stick to the required narrative, or carefully select from a lengthy interview that which fits with the required narrative. I do, however, have a suspicion the BBC have absolutely no difficulty whatsoever in finding senior clerics who are very happy to stick to the Guardian narrative. I need to add here that I'm not against the church speaking out on issues which probably fall into what most people will consider to be the political. If we've nothing to say on that, we look then as if we're just simply hiding away in our churches in rather irrelevant and escapist, obscurantist rituals. Now, I grew up in a household where the ethos was, used to be fairly standard, it was Northern Socialist Methodist. Religion and politics were talked at Sunday lunch, and the idea that I generally associate with Karl Barth of taking a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, that was how we functioned, and it strikes me as an appropriate approach to prayer and ministry in general. I might need to qualify that and say it did when the media had more integrity than it does now. However, Barth's approach was then to interpret the newspaper from your Bible. It's too easy to drift from Barth's position to taking your agenda from the news and then finding biblical ideas to support the newspaper's ideology. Now, in the past, Times and Telegraph was seen as the paper of the C of E, and probably true today of many of the laity. For clergy, however, the Guardian appears to be in the ascendancy, or certainly among those who've got a high profile. So this is back to my suggestion as to why we might have what we do in terms of clerics on the media, because the media select those who present the correct narrative and therefore high-profile clergy means those appearing in the media who are selected because they give the correct narrative. So Barth's exhortation to have a biblically directed politics seems, for many who appear in the media, to have morphed just into having a Guardian-directed biblical interpretation. And for some clergy, it appears to have gone even further. The Bible's been dispensed with, and they just simply follow the Guardian on its latest cause. And there certainly seem to be plenty within the C of E, no shortage of them on Twitter, clergy Twitter, who appear to have decided that being woke is the direction to follow. Emphasis here on the church following, not leading. We don't need to follow the latest wacky trend for social justice. The church has been at the forefront of bringing social justice to the world for 2,000 years. Okay, so the church has also been involved in some terrible actions, all of which, however, were entirely socially acceptable at the time. But the church has also taken the lead in challenging injustice and giving internal arguments to convince other Christians how the gospel demands that we live. So what some of the latest movements show us, and I'm thinking particularly here of Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter, what we see from these people is a really deep yearning for a religious way of life. We see people who clearly they want meaning and purpose in their lives. They're passionate about caring for the poor and the weak, or at least they claim to be. And this is mainly where I'm going with this one. They want ritual expression for their concerns. Instead of simply jumping on the latest social justice warrior bandwagon and having a senior cleric speak at one of their rallies or state support in a BBC interview, it would be better to see here the hunger within the population for something that, well, I'm going to take a guess here, that traditional Anglicanism could probably feed. Now, presumably that HTB strand of the church has no appeal to this Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter lot, because they are exactly the right demographic, and I'm assuming they're not attending those sort of churches. Okay, well, what about the traditional Church of England? There's no shortage of ritual in which to embed and express religious feelings. The mysticism, which has rather been lost from a lot of the C of E, which I think is probably one of the directions I'm going with this, the mysticism, that should tap into that, let's call it the Glastonbury strand, which is certainly well represented in Extinction Rebellion. And looking at what we can do as clergy then, well, a serious engagement with the prophets would be one. You've got the constant call for social justice. Amos is the obvious example here. Or looking at the Extinction Rebellion and how we can take on their ideas. I mean, that, as we look at those prophets as they had running battles with the fertility cults and nature religions of the Canaanites, a major theme in the Old Testament. So there's lots there that could feed our thinking, which would enable us to engage with those SJW type movements that we see presented to us with many followers, a demographic showing a yearning for religion. The purpose of this video is not to provide ideas of how we can revitalise the traditional Church of England. It's to do some analysis. One of the reasons there's not going to be much how is because I'm thinking out loud. I'm working this out as I go along. Thinking about this to a large extent is new to me. I spent 22 years fully embedded in the muscular Christianity of a traditional English independent school, beautiful Victorian Gothic of a chapel, oak and stone, high quality stained glass, full of story, which I used as visual aids at various points in the year, war memorials, which meant we were always sitting in the presence of the dead, candles, I used incense sometimes, robust blokey singing of traditional hymns. Now, I'm under no illusion that these young men all left school as committed Christians. No, they didn't. But the majority of them will have left the school with some degree of getting what it was all about, and young men who would be able to fit very comfortably within the traditional Church of England. Example of that is when one of the sixth form girls from the girls section of the foundation, she was killed in a car crash. The boys had absolutely no difficulty using chapel. They knew exactly where they needed to be, where they needed to go. They sat in chapel, they lit candles. It was just the obvious way for them to express the communal grief. They certainly got what one aspect of chapel was all about. Now, my current school, I've been there about 2 years now, has a very dull chapel. It's set in the close of Salisbury Cathedral, which is why I assume the bishop who founded the school saw no reason at all to spend much money on the chapel. So I've been jolted out of the complacency of a couple of decades in the same place, and with one of the world's finest cathedrals sitting next door to the school, I'm doing some fresh thinking, the implementation of which was derailed somewhat by COVID-19. So I'm not really going to give many ideas, but I'll just float one that has been buzzing around in my mind since my move. And it's about the Book of Common Prayer stuff, Gothic setting of the cathedral. Not choral evensong. I just don't think that my students could just go into a choral evensong, top quality as it is at Salisbury Cathedral, and they would get it. It's got to be something thought through a bit more. But we should be able to do this. I mean, just floating some ideas here. You know, the sort of Hogwarts. These are Harry Potter brought up all the way through. They've grown up with it. So you've got that sort of Hogwarts mysterious Latin spells. Okay, BCP's Old English, but it's just as incomprehensible to them as the Latin. Tapping into that Gothic strand of the metal scene, possibly. My experience of using traditional hymns with the boys, far from them being put off by the incomprehensible words, they actually like it. It's the fully comprehensible words of modern hymns that they appear to be a bit uncomfortable with, because actually they can fully understand the words and they're not really sure they want to sing those words. And as I draw to a close, I want to identify a strand in this support, this interest in the traditional Church of England, which as far as I'm concerned is not even remotely helpful. I'll call it the nostalgia approach. It often goes alongside the view I mentioned earlier about wanting the Church of England to be there, providing the services they like, just in case they decide occasionally to turn up. There's no point in clergy just moaning about the state of the Church of England, the lack of a strong traditional Church of England. What is needed, what we need are concrete ideas which can be tried out and then shared. Do they work? Don't they work? Pooling ideas so we can tweak or just reject depending on the results of trying things out. As an illustration of what is of no use, I'll go back to my interest in using BCP. I've been floating this around what I would consider BCP circles for at least a year. And I've had no one come back to me who has actually done this. I've had plenty of people who've just completely ignored emails and Twitter contacts or whatever it might be. One priest who was recommended to contact him because he'd spoken at a conference he'd led. He was the one leading the session on using the BCP. I phoned him up and he spent 15 minutes on the phone giving me advice on how to be a school chaplain. Wasn't impressed with that, but he had absolutely no experience to share with me about actually using BCP with school age boys. So let's be careful as we want to strengthen and develop the traditional C of E, that we're not just talking a good traditional Church of England game, but then with the sort of people who get out on the field and can't even catch the ball. The church has a long tradition of being a place where people can meet with God, where we can experience the supernatural, and also we can do politics in a way which has a distinctive Christian edge to it. Rediscovering and presenting the supernatural, it shouldn't just mean an escapist obscurantism where people go and hide from the unpleasantness of all this modern 21st century life and we disappear off into our wonderful world of Gothic architecture, incense and ancient language. How we can do this revitalisation of the traditional Church of England and draw more people, I mean, numbers do matter. It's not part of my project here. I'm simply trying to lay out appropriate questions, just point in the direction of what might be appropriate analysis, and trying to create a conversation with others who are looking to find ways forward by drawing on the past. I don't know what it might be, rediscovery of Eucharistic theology. It might be drawing on the very powerful medieval mysticism, which has always been there in the church somewhere. I'm working this out as I produce this video. It's my hope that this video could be part of bringing together those with an interest in this project, so we can share ideas to enable us to work together to bring that richness of traditional Church of England to more people, and through it to make a difference to the lives of the people in our parishes, or in my case, my school.